3 trials should be faster than the first 3. The sprint trial was the biggest trial, so we spent the most time on that. So I'll be talking about the DAPT trial, DAPT score. So for starters, the DAPT study was finished about a year ago from last fall, it's 2014. And this question was about whether or not we should continue dual antiplatelet therapy in the setting of a stent. And basically, do you have more complications of ischemia and stent thrombosis, or do you have more complications of bleeding? And so looking at their data, you can see, well, yeah, they had less stent thrombosis, they had less of their composite endpoint, less MI, but then this was balanced by the increase in bleeding and increase in dying. So in another slide, which is a very similar thing, all these slides, by the way, are stolen off the AHA site, so you can look at them or, I don't know, question me for doing that, but whatever. This was from the discussant who discussed this DAPT score, and he looked at both the DAPT trial and the Pegasus trial, which looked at dosing of ticagrelor, and also the same thing. It's showing that you have, if you extend out dual antiplatelet therapy, you have a decrease in your composite endpoint, and then it's balanced by your bleeding risk. Similarly with the low dose, the doses of ticagrelor in the Pegasus trials, those looked at, do you have the same thrombosis, do you have more bleeding, just like everything in ECS. So the reason that the same group from Boston decided to reanalyze the data from the DAPT trials, they said, is there a way that we can risk stratify people such that certain people should continue on dual antiplatelet therapy for the additional year versus not continuing? So the same way as all the other studies, they're going to look at the risk of ischemia and then balance that with the risk of bleeding. So back to the original study design, because this is really the inclusion-exclusion criteria are going to be based off of the initial DAPT trial. So inclusion was FDA-approved drug-eluting or bare metal stents. They had to be candidates for the cyanopiridine. They were excluded if they were already on other oral anticoagulants or if they were going to die pretty quickly. So they randomized them, and they basically, everybody took dual antiplatelet therapy, and at 12 months they randomized everybody to see whether or not they would be on it for the additional period of time. Then they watched them for an additional 3 months, and just to see if they had any more of that. Make sense? So they developed 2 prediction models. One's the ischemic model, once again looking at these composite endpoints, the stent thrombosis, MI, and they looked at bleeding models using the Gusto criteria for moderate and severe bleeding 12 to 30 months after the index of PCI. They used cost regression analysis, and they looked at 37 different variables, and then they externally validated these against a different trial population that was not included in the DAPT study, so against the PROTECT trial population. And once again, just describing the score, they wanted to see, does their the risk reduction in the ischemic events minus the risk increase in bleeding events, that's going to give their net treatment benefit. So they went through all these different characteristics. The ones in red were going to be basically negative predictors. The ones in blue, like diabetes, LVEF, prior CABG, these wind up being somewhere in the middle range, and then the green ones, excuse me, I missed those. Let me go to the next slide because it actually makes more sense. So they basically look at stent thrombosis. They saw, does this create a significant difference in either the bleeding versus the MI thrombosis rate? And this summarizes what the last slide does, is that you have bleeding predictors, bleeding predictors of age, and then you have ischemia predictors, which are all these things, and then the hypertension, renal dysfunction, and PAD, those are the ones that were in green, I think, on the last slide. And they were basically not that important in the overall criteria. So they tried to simplify the score as much as possible, and this is what they wound up getting to. So here's the score. If you have an age greater than 75, you get -2 points, and then you can follow this all the way down. So the predictors are kind of similar to like the normal CHA2DS2-VASc score and everything else that we're predicting coronary disease, but diabetes, smoking, PCI, and then it looked at, did you have an MI at your initial presentation? Did you have a vein graft PCI? Because then that is increased risk for closing off their veins, and also the stent diameter. So then they put these on a histogram to see where everybody falls out amongst all the patients that were in the DAPT study. And I think there are around 11,000 patients or so, really big study. So now they divided these out into Q1 is equal to a DAPT score of -2 to 0. Q2 is a DAPT score of 1. Q3 is a DAPT score of 2. And then Q4 is a DAPT score greater than 2. And once again, looking at stent thrombosis, MI, and the gusto bleeding criteria. And what they found is that they found this nice division point right at 2 and above, and then 1 and below. So at this area of 2 and above, you get the greatest decrease in your risk of stent thrombosis if you're continuing people on DAPT for that additional year. Once again, for myocardial infarction, you have the same, basically a nice cutoff. For the gusto bleeding criteria, is a little bit less of a distinct cutoff, but nonetheless, still 2 seem to be the favorite number. Looking at mortality benefit, they drew the line here again. So you have a DAPT score of greater than or equal to 2 on the right-hand side versus a DAPT score less than 2. Net adverse events with the DAPT score. And so this is what the conglomerate of everything that they've looked at in this trial, with your net adverse events being less if they continue the therapy and they have a DAPT score greater than or equal to 2. Everything makes sense so far?
So is there really their way to explain away how you died more when you took dual antiplatelet therapy?
Yes. Well, I don't know. Some people would, initially they thought of it.
I mean, that's what it looks like to me, is they're like, well, let's massage all this data and say, well,
right.
In some, people died more, but guess what, their sins didn't cross.
The discussant, the first thing he said when he came out is that prior to this, he basically considered the initial DAPT study basically a null trial because people died more, because they had all these things, even though they showed a small benefit from taking the medicine for a longer period of time. And so I think, yeah, like exactly, like I think that's the way that you can look at it. And so in the end, they went back, now that they have a DAPT score, they applied it to all 11,000, or excuse me, in this situation, 5,700 of these patients that had a DAPT score less than 2, and they redid the DAPT study graph, and basically showed that this was not too significant, this was definitely not significant, and the gusto bleeding criteria was significant, which is what you'd expect. If you had a DAPT score less than 2, you'd expect them to have additional bleeding. Similarly, if you have a DAPT score that's greater than 2, another 6,000 patients, now you can start to separate the curves from the DAPT trial, and you have significance in MI and then the major adverse cardiac event, but you do not have a difference in the bleeding criteria. So the exact opposite of the prior slide. Everybody's on board still? So all this does is it gives you a scoring system that you can figure out if you should continue somebody. Limitations, I think it's a post-hoc analysis in the first place. So anytime you go back and look at the data, you always wonder about, you're not really powering your study to do this. Nonetheless, I think it creates an interesting model. They look back at the PROTECT cohorts, and compared to the DAPT patients, they have differences in their ischemic and their bleeding risk. So none of the trials are created equal. I won't talk about that. So now, once again, once you have all these different patients, if you have a low DAPT score, I think it's easy because it's a very easy thing to apply to your patients. But it helps clinicians decide whether or not you want to continue for that additional year.
Go back and show us what is the gap. Acronym doesn't help us.
Not at all. It's actually kind of tricky to use. We were sitting in clinic last week, and we plugged it into Curiosity, because there was a guy that was already like 18 months into that. We're like, what's another 6 months? So on their calculator, though, they have a DAPT. I think it's there's a study calculator they use online. But it's not an easy thing. But I think once you look at it, in my mind, if somebody's had, these are the obvious things. If somebody has had prior, all the PCIs, prior MI, and then stent diameter that's small, everything makes sense in a way. It's something that you can continue to continue to do.
The DAPT score is to predict.
No, it's the net.
Because I'm surprised that prior bleeding is not part of the DAPT score. Like, they're linear regression, right? How did that? Where's prior bleeding down there?
Blacked out.
Yeah.
0.2.
Prior MI.
So there's a trend. 0.2.
Yeah, there was one more baseline characteristic slide that they had of all this that was on there. And I think it wasn't, I don't think their event rates may not have been high enough to actually include it.
The other thing you'd argue is that somebody has like prior stem thrombosis.
Exactly.
Do like platelet therapy and that's not part of it.
So the last slide is just to show the DAPT, where you can find it on the DAPT study project.
Really can't believe. That's the only thing, there's very few negatives on that.
Of doing, it's
No,
age.
on the calculator, there's very few negatives, so they're pretty much saying that everyone has, that anyone under the age of 65.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what you expect, because if they're really young, they're probably not gonna fall on that.
Break down the patients who had their stable and got a stent. So those, I mean, I think the vendor from the Reagan talked about this. In case you do antigen therapy, but this got a stent because he had positive test.
Mm-hmm.
Work is only changing things.
Here's the initial inclusion criteria for this study.
Well, they get a point for doing it.
Yeah. So like,
That's true.
last person, the patient was doing 8 days, he get 2 points. And the patient was just fine, they wanted to. Yeah, right?
So if you have, in my your presentation, you get a point.
It's 2 points for ECS, 1 point for just positive test.
Here's how you'll deal with it, just like me. Refer to interventional for them to say how long to continue. What's that?
Honestly, yeah, like I'd go, the calculator is, it's like 3 things that it fill out, it's super easy.
Yeah.
But I don't think the ACS is, I'm not sure why it's 2 points.
Oh, no, for the patient who came in with positive that didn't really have it tonight, who's got a test.
Right.
Versus someone who presented with non-SDL HMI and got a test. Or acute coronary syndrome.
Right. Oh, if they have both of those. So like in here, if you have a prior PCI or prior MI, you have 1 point. If you have an MI, the index presentation, then you get an additional point.
Yeah.
There's nothing in there that looks the stable angina and the prior stroke.
Well, I'm trying to say that if patient who came in with stable angina, got a stent, you only have 1 point. Versus that same patient who actually had acute class rupture, and then got a stent, who was 2 points. So that patient is just based on this therapy, higher risk.
Yeah.
And should be on it longer than that.
Exactly.
Now they're.
I think that's all.